The jungle was strangely quiet that night. Too quiet. The wind that usually swept through the tall grasses had stopped. The animals, always so loud and alive, were nowhere to be heard. And there, in the distance, stood a figure, glowing, bright and terrifying. He dragged something behind him, something small and fragile, as his lights cut through the darkness. Miriam watched, frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She has come to Africa to study its wonders, but this was no wonder. This was a nightmare come to life. Miriam Evans has always been curious about the world. Born at the end of the Second World War in a small Welsh village, she was never content to live a simple life. While other girls dreamt of families and home, Miriam dreamt of adventures and animals. She loved the natural world, especially animals. When she finished school, she became a scientist. Her love for nature took her far from home, and before long, she found herself traveling to Africa. Africa was a land of mystery, and Miriam loved it instantly. She spent years studying animals, especially the reptiles and the birds, the jungles, the savannas, the rivers. Everything was so alive in a way Miriam never imagined. The land itself seemed to hum with energy. But it was in 1969, during her trip to a small remote village in West Africa, that her life changed forever. Miriam was 25 and her husband, Matty, as she always called him, was 32. Matty was a microbiologist, tall, quiet and smart. He spoke several African languages, which made him the unofficial translator of their team. They were there to study lions and the rare western black rhinoceros, which number was shrinking because of poaching. The village they stayed in was small and the people were kind but distant. Miriam sensed something strange in the air from the moment they arrived. The villagers barely spoke to her, and when they did, their words was laced with warning she didn't fully understand. "You must stay indoor at night," said one of the village hunters, a tall man with deep scarf skin. His name was Kofi, as his dark eye never left Miriam's, especially if you are with a child. Miriam wasn't pregnant, but the comment unsettled her. Why would Kofi say such a thing? She took it off as a village superstition, but her husband Matty seemed more affected. "Let's just stay in after the dark," he said with his voice low. Miriam didn't argue. Something about the way Kofi spoke made her skin crawl. It was as if he knew something terrible would happen, but he couldn't tell her the whole truth. Days passed uneventfully. Miriam and Matty spent their days out on the plains, watching the animals, taking notes and setting up their makeshift camp. The sunset in Africa was beautiful, and Miriam found herself lost in the colors that bathed the skies. Deep purples, gold and reds. But as soon as the sun dipped behind the horizon, that strange silence crept back in. The village, usually bursting with children and laughter, became ghostly quiet at night. The men stood guard with spears, but Miriam noticed something strange. They never set up fires after the dark, not even to keep the lions away. She asked Matty about it, but he just shrugged. "It's probably just a costume, don't worry." But Miriam did worry. She couldn't explain it, but the quiet was wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was so thick, like a blanket smoothing the life out of the village. The usual sound of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. Then came the third night. Miriam woke up suddenly. The air in the hut felt heavy, like something was pressing down her chest. Matty was still fast asleep beside her, snoring softly. She listened, straining her ears. At first, she heard nothing, but then, slowly, a sound reached her, a faint whimpering, like a child crying far away. Her heart raced. She sat up, careful not to wake Matty, and tiptoed to the door of their small hut. The whimpering grew louder, and Miriam's stomach churned with unease. She peeked outside, and her blood ran cold. In the center of the village, bathed in a strange, unnatural light, stood a figure. He wasn't tall, but he seemed larger than life itself. His glowing body casting strange shadows across the ground. The light wasn't from a torch or a fire, it was coming from him. He glowed like the moon, but his light was cold, it was lifeless. And there in his grip was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 3 years. Miriam had seen her that afternoon, laughing and playing in the depths. Now the child's tiny body was limp, and tears streamed down her cheeks as the figure dragged her across the village. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to scream, to rush out and stop the glowing figure, to save the child, but before she could move, a strong hand grabbed her from behind and pulled her inside the hut. It was Matty. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You can't." Miriam struggled against him. "We have to help her. That thing, whatever it is going to kill her." But Matty only held her tighter, his voice shaking. "We can't stop it. The villagers knew. Look." Miriam stopped struggling and looked out again. The villagers were standing outside their hut, watching in silence. Not a single one moved. The women held their children close, their faces tight with fear. The men stood with their spears, but none of them stepped forward. None of them even tried to help the little girl. Miriam's heart broke. How could they just stand there? How could they let this happen? As they watched, the glowing figure stopped. The little girl whimpered one last time, and then the figure bent down. His glowing hand reached out, and with a horrifying clinking crack, he crushed her little head. Miriam gasped, tears streaming down her face. She turned away, burying her face in Matty's chest. She couldn't watch anymore. She couldn't understand how something so evil could exist. The glowing figure, now holding the lifeless child, walked off into the darkness, leaving the village in silence once again. For a long time, Miriam and Matty sat there, holding each other. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for what they have just witnessed. The next morning, Miriam couldn't stay silent. She demanded answer from Kofi, from the village elders, from anyone who could listen. Who was that, and what did he want with that poor child? The villagers couldn't meet her eyes. They mumbled soft excuses, saying it was a spirit, an ancient cause. He's the Mtoto Mziwi, Kofi finally said, his voice hollowed. The child thief. He takes the firstborns. Miriam's heart dropped. Firstborns? Kofi nodded grimly. He comes every few years. Always the firstborn. There is nothing we can do. He is too powerful. Miriam couldn't believe it. But why do you let him? Why don't you fight him? Kofi shook his head. We tried once, long ago. It didn't end well. The villagers had fought back, but the cost has been too great. The Mtoto Mziwi have taken more children, killed more people. Since then, they had made a terrible peace with the creature. They did not interfere. They did not fight. Miriam's heart reeled. She thought about the girl, about how helpless she had been, and the cold realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had been in Africa for 2 months. She had felt ill recently, tired and weak, and then she knew why. She was pregnant. Miriam didn't wait to find what would happen next. She and Matty packed their things that very day. They didn't tell the villagers. They couldn't. Miriam didn't want to hear any more warning, any more stories. All she wanted was to run as far away as possible. Matty drove them through the night, their jeep bouncing over the rough terrains. The jungle seemed to be closed in around them, the trees casting a long shadows that flamed like a reaching hands. Every sound made Miriam jump. She imagined the glowing figure in the dark, following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But none came. They reached Cape Town safely, and it was there that Miriam learned that she was 2 months pregnant. But the weight of what she had seen, what she had experienced, never left her. The Mtoto Mziwi haunted her dreams, and she never returned to the village. Years later, Miriam gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But the fear of losing her never left. She watched her child grow, always keeping her close, always afraid that the child thief would come for her. But the real horror came when her second child, her son, was born. Miriam's firstborn daughter disappeared when she was still a baby. It happened on a quiet night, much like that cursed village. Miriam had been putting her daughter to bed when she heard a faint whimper, just like the one from the little girl in the village all those years ago. Her heart froze. But when she opened the crib, the daughter was gone. No one saw the glowing figure that night, but Miriam knew. Deep in her heart, she knew who had taken her daughter. The Mtoto Mziwi have come for her first child. Miriam's grief was unbearable. She searched everywhere, called the police, even hired private investigators, but there was no trace of her little girl. She tried to tell Matty what had happened, but he couldn't believe her anymore. "It's just your imagination," he said, holding her tight as she cried in his arm. "It wasn't real, Miriam. That village, that figure, it was just a bad dream." But Miriam knew the truth. The child thief was real, and he had stolen her daughter. She couldn't prove it, but she could feel it in her bones. The same icy terror that gripped her in that African village now haunted her every waking moment. Years passed, and Miriam and Matty tried to move on. They had another child, a boy this time, and for a while, life seemed normal again. But the fear never left Miriam. Every night, she checked on her son, terrified that the child thief would come again. She lived in constant fear, her eyes always scanning the shadows, waiting for the glowing figure to appear. It was her son's 5th birthday that it happened again. Miriam has just tucked him into the bed, kissing his forehead and whispering a soft goodnight. As she left, she felt it, a heavy, suffocating presence in the air, the same aggressive silence that swallowed the village years ago. Her heart raced. She ran back to her son's room, her mind screaming at her to protect him. But when she opened the door, the room was dark and empty. The crib was still, the blankets untouched. "No!" Miriam screamed, collapsing to her knee. "Not again, please, not again." Matty found her sobbing on the floor, clutching her son's tiny blanket to her chest. He searched the house, the yard, everywhere, but their little boy was gone, just like their daughter, just like that little girl in the village. Miriam was inconsolable. She knew that Mtoto Mziwi has taken her children, just as he has taken others, and no one could stop him. Years passed, and Miriam grew old. The world around her changed. The memory of that glowing figure, The child thief never failed. She has never had more children, and Matty, heartbroken by their loss, grew distant. He tried to confront Miriam, but the weight of the past hung between them like a dark cloud. Miriam spent her days in quiet solitude, haunted by the face of her stolen children. She never spoke of Mtoto Mziwi to anyone, not even to Matty. The villagers had warned her all those years ago. Some things were better left unsaid, but the memories of darkest nights in Africa and the terrible growth of the child thief stayed with her until her last breath. When Miriam passed away, her secret went with her to the grave, but the story of Mtoto Mziwi lived on. Whispered in dark corners and passed down generations, the villagers still feared the child thief, warning their children to stay indoors at night and never stray too far away from the village. And so the legend of the child thief continues, a story whispered in hushed voice in small villages across Africa. Some say he still remains at the plains, glowing in the distance, searching for the firstborns. Others said he has disappeared, swallowed by the modern world and forgotten by time. But the villagers know the truth. Mtoto Mziwi never dies. He waits, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike when the time is right. And so, the warning remains. When the night is too quiet and the wind refuses to blow, keep your child close, for the child thief is always watching.